Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going deep on a figure who is, well, he's definitely become a crypto celebrity, but also a magnet for controversy. Richard Hart.
Yeah, he's a fascinating case for sure. To really separate fact from fiction with him, we've got a mountain of sources to dig through: biographical info, project overviews, legal documents. It's a lot.
It really is. It's kind of like this guy's lived multiple lives already, and it all kind of feeds into his current projects, HEX, PulseChain, PulseX. So where do we even begin with a story this wild?
Well, before he was Richard Hart, he was Richard Schuler, a young man with an apparent interest in tech, but also this knack for pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable online.
Right, like those internet spamming courses he was selling. Some of these sources really dig into that early stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's relevant because you see, even back then in the early 2000s, this pattern of him finding loopholes, operating in these legal gray areas. In fact, he was sued in 2002 for sending out deceptive spam emails.
Yeah, he was labeled a spam king by some, which doesn't exactly scream trustworthy financial guru. But then things get even wilder. Between 2005 and 2007, he pops up in Panama. And not just for the beaches, right?
Definitely not a vacation. Reports from PanamaGuide.com and the work of journalist Miguel Antonio Bernal allege that Hart was involved with a criminal network during this time. We're talking accusations of money laundering, extortion, even blackmail.
It's like something out of a movie. So how does someone go from alleged criminal activities in Panama to launching this massive cryptocurrency project like HEX?
That's the million-dollar question. And HEX itself is just as intriguing as its creator. Hart launched it in 2019, positioning it as a sort of certificate of deposit on the blockchain, promising huge returns to those who stake their tokens.
But HEX was immediately hit with accusations of being a Ponzi scheme, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some of these sources cite returns as high as 38%. That's insane.
Yeah. The Ponzi accusations have followed Hart from the very beginning, and yeah, those promised returns were eye-catching, to say the least. But it's important to note that HEX attracted a massive following, reaching a market cap of over $40 billion at its peak.
Okay, so a huge controversy, but also huge success. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. And then he follows that up with PulseChain.
Right. PulseChain is where things get really interesting from a technical standpoint. Hart presented it as this solution to some of Ethereum's issues, a fork designed to be faster, cheaper, more efficient.
And the fundraising was unlike anything I'd ever seen. He called it a sacrifice. And people sent billions of dollars worth of crypto with no guarantee of anything in return.
It was a bold move, and it really speaks to Hart's ability to inspire his community. He framed it as this chance to build something new, something better, and people bought into that vision.
He was also making some pretty big claims about PulseChain being more environmentally friendly than Ethereum. Do our sources agree on that?
That's definitely a point of contention. Ethereum's move to proof of stake may have shifted the landscape on energy consumption, but the environmental aspect was a key part of Hart's pitch for PulseChain for sure.
And then there's PulseX, the decentralized exchange.
Exactly. PulseX is designed to work seamlessly with PulseChain, allowing users to trade a variety of tokens, including HEX. It has this mechanism that burns a portion of each transaction fee, potentially increasing the value of the PLS token over time.
Okay, so we've got this interconnected ecosystem of projects, all built by Hart, all with his unique branding and messaging, but then the red flags start to appear.
Well, the Ponzi scheme accusations never really went away, and then in 2023, the SEC drops a bombshell, a lawsuit against Richard Hart. They accused him of conducting unregistered securities offerings and raising over $1 billion from investors illegally.
And it didn't stop there. The SEC also alleged that he was living large off investor money, spending millions on luxury goods, including that infamous Enigma Black Diamond.
It was a major escalation of the conflict. The SEC was essentially saying that Hart had built his entire empire on deception and manipulation.
They went into detail about the Hex flush address and how Hart allegedly used it to recycle investor funds, making it seem like there was more demand for HEX than there actually was.
Right. The SEC's complaint paints this picture of a calculated effort to artificially inflate the price of HEX and mislead investors.
And then there's the whole fake staking program accusation. Our sources describe how the SEC believes this was another tactic used to manipulate the market and benefit Hart personally.
It's a complex web of allegations, and it's hard to know what to believe. But what's clear is that Richard Hart is in a fight for his reputation, his fortune, and potentially his freedom.
It's like this incredibly complicated web of projects and accusations around Richard Hart. And it's all built on this foundation of Well, let's be honest, some pretty out there claims.
That's one way to put it. But you got to remember his ability to make those claims stick to attract those followers and investors. That's a key part of the story.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's easy to get lost in, the technical details of HEX, PulseChain, and PulseX. But we can't forget about the human element. This is a guy who's built a massive following, a community of people who believe in him, despite all the red flags.
And that's what makes the SEC's lawsuit so interesting. It's not just about, potential financial wrongdoing. It's about the very nature of belief and trust in the crypto space.
I see what you mean. So how does the SEC's case actually play into that? Like, what are the specific arguments they're making about how Hart built this, following this community of believers?
One key element is this sacrifice narrative that Hart used for both PulseChain and PulseX. The SEC is claiming that this was a deliberate attempt to circumvent securities laws by framing the investments as donations, appealing to people's desire to be part of something bigger than themselves.
It's a brilliant marketing tactic, even if it is legally dubious. This narrative of sacrificing for the future of decentralized finance, for freedom from the traditional financial system.
Right.
And it clearly resonated with a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. He tapped into a deep-seated distrust of authority, a desire for financial independence that's very strong in certain segments of the crypto community. And by using terms like sacrifice, he created this sense of exclusivity, like being part of this select group who are ahead of the curve.
It's almost like a religious movement, with Hart as the charismatic leader who is promising salvation through crypto.
That's a strong comparison. But I think there are definitely some parallels there. There's this element of blind faith, of unwavering loyalty that you see in both.
And that's what makes the SEC's case so fascinating. They're not just going after Hart for alleged financial crimes. They're challenging the very foundation of his following the belief system that he's created around his projects.
Exactly. If the SEC can prove that Hart intentionally misled investors, that he used manipulative tactics to build his community and to inflate the value of his tokens, it could have this ripple effect through the entire crypto space.
It could really shake people's faith in these decentralized systems, in the idea of crypto as a force for good.
That's the potential impact here. And it's why this case is being watched so closely by regulators, investors, and the entire crypto community.
But let's get back to the psychology of Hart's followers for a second. It's easy to dismiss them as naive or greedy, but I think it's more complicated than that.
I agree. Many of these people genuinely believe in Hart's vision. They see him as this disruptor, an innovator who's fighting against this corrupt system. They're willing to overlook the red flags, the accusations, because they believe in the bigger picture, the potential for a better future.
So how do you explain that level of devotion? What is it about Hart that inspires such fervent belief?
Well, he's undeniably charismatic. He's a master communicator, especially on social media. He knows how to connect with his audience, to make them feel like they're part of something special.
And he's not afraid to play the victim, to cast himself as the underdog, fighting against these powerful forces that want to silence him.
That's a key part of his strategy, creating this us versus them mentality. It strengthens the bond within his community, makes them more resistant to outside criticism.
It's a classic cult leader tactic.
There are definitely some similarities there. The creation of an enemy, the promise of salvation, the unwavering loyalty to the leader. It's all there.
So is Richard Hart a cult leader?
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah.
But he's definitely created this very powerful and devoted following, one that's based on this mix of genuine belief, financial speculation, and the allure of being part of something revolutionary.
And that's what makes this whole story so fascinating.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about cryptocurrency and financial regulations. We're talking about the psychology of belief, the power of community, and the dark side of charisma.
It's a reminder that even in the decentralized world of crypto, where individual empowerment is supposed to be paramount, there's still this very human element at play.
And that human element is what makes this story so unpredictable and potentially dangerous.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to understand not just the technical details of Hart's projects, but also the psychological dynamics at play, because that's where the real story lies.
So we've got this complex mix of financial allegations, psychological manipulation, a community of true believers. What happens next? Where does this story go from here? All right, so we've spent all this time unpacking the world of Richard Hart, from his early days to the creation of HEX, PulseChain, PulseX. But kind of looming over it all is this SEC lawsuit. And we need to figure out what that actually means for Hart, his followers, and the future of crypto itself.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it? And the SEC is making some serious accusations. I think it's important to break them down clearly so the listener understands what Hart is up against here.
Yeah, for sure. So first up is the unregistered securities offering. What does that even mean in the context of Hart's projects?
The SEC is basically arguing that HEX, PulseChain, PulseX weren't just innovative tech projects, they were investment schemes. And Hart, they allege, was selling these investments to the public without actually following the regulations required for securities.
And that's not just, some paperwork oversight. This is a big deal.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. The SEC has this whole framework in place to protect investors, to ensure transparency and fairness in the markets. If you're offering securities, you have to play by the rules. The SEC is claiming that Hart didn't and that he raised over $1 billion illegally.
And this ties into the whole sacrifice narrative we talked about. The SEC is saying he used that language specifically to sidestep these very regulations.
Precisely. By calling it a sacrifice, he tried to position it as something other than a traditional investment. But the SEC isn't buying it. They're looking at what was actually offered, not just the language used to describe it.
Right. And then there's this misappropriation of funds. The SEC is claiming that Hart spent millions of investor dollars on himself. Is that common in these types of cases?
It's not unusual to see those allegations of personal enrichment when someone is accused of running an investment scheme. And in Hart's case, the SEC has actually documented his spending on luxury items, including that Enigma Black Diamond.
Which, let's be honest, is a pretty hard thing to explain away if those funds did come from investors.
It doesn't help his case, that's for sure. But I think the most complex and potentially damaging accusation is market manipulation.
Right, the HEX flush address and this alleged recycling of investor funds. Even with all of our research, this one was particularly hard to follow. Can you break it down for our listener?
Okay, so the SEC is alleging that Hart created this system where he could artificially inflate the price of HEX by making it look like there was way more buying and selling activity than there actually was. He used this thing called the HEX flush address to move funds around, creating the illusion of high demand and driving up the price.
So it's like a magician's trick, making something appear out of thin air.
Kinda, yeah. The SEC is claiming that he was manipulating the market to benefit himself and potentially early investors in HEX.
And that also connects back to that fake staking program accusation. The SEC believes that this was another tool used to artificially restrict the supply of HEX tokens again to influence the price.
Exactly. It's all part of this bigger picture that the SEC is trying to paint. They're saying that Hart wasn't just operating outside the regulations, but that he was actively and intentionally deceiving investors for personal gain.
Wow. So with all these accusations flying around, what are the potential outcomes here? What are the stakes for Richard Hart?
I mean, the worst case scenario is that he loses the case and is found guilty on all charges. That could mean some pretty hefty fines, being banned from operating in the securities industry, even jail time.
Yeah, that would be a pretty dramatic fall from grace for someone who really did position himself as a revolutionary in the crypto world.
For sure, it would be a major blow to his reputation. And it could even bring down the whole HEX, PulseChain, PulseX ecosystem. But there are other possibilities. This case could drag on for years, costing both sides a fortune in legal fees and creating a lot of uncertainty that erodes investor confidence.
Basically a war of attrition.
Exactly. And there's always the chance of a settlement. Hart could agree to pay fines, make changes to how he does business, and avoid those more serious penalties.
But would he be willing to admit any wrongdoing to tarnish his carefully crafted image?
That's the million-dollar question. Hart has denied every accusation so far. He paints himself as a victim of a system that just doesn't get his innovative ideas.
So where do you think this is all going? What's your take on the future of Richard Hart and his whole crypto empire?
It's honestly hard to say. The legal process is complex and unpredictable, as we all know. But regardless of what happens, this case is a landmark event for the history of cryptocurrency. It raises some fundamental questions about regulation, innovation, and the role of belief in this decentralized world.
It's like we've reached the climax of a movie. We've followed this character through this wild journey. And now we're all just holding our breath to see what happens next.
And the ending of this story could have huge consequences for the entire crypto landscape.
So for our listeners, what does all of this mean for you? Well, if you're invested in any of Hart's projects, buckle up, because it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Even if you're not directly involved, this whole saga offers some really valuable lessons about the importance of critical thinking, doing your due diligence, and really understanding the risks of any investment, especially in the fast-moving world of crypto.
Richard Hart's story is a reminder that disruption and innovation often come with a pretty hefty price tag. The question is, who will ultimately pay that price?
That's something we'll all be watching closely as this story continues to unfold.